Evolution is a tricky thing to understand, and there are many questions that we still have about it. Why did some Pokemon evolve when others don't? Why don't humans evolve? Why are there so many different ways for a Pokemon to evolve? Despite all these questions we still have, there's no argument that it can lead to massive changes in a Pokemon's biology. It can add or take away types, switch around abilities, or even add or take away limbs. My scientist friend Dan actually did a paper on this phenomenon where he explored the genetics of Pokemon that can and can't evolve. It's an interesting read, but I don't remember what his conclusion was on the matter. And a very good example of these extreme biological changes is the Oddish line. Hello and welcome everyone to the Pokemon Care Guides, where we go through how to care and raise different Pokemon lines in your own home. Today, we'll be going over the dual grass poison types that are part of the Oddish line. Oddish itself is a small 1.5 foot tall bipedal Pokemon. Its body itself consists of a blue round center that functions as both head and torso, a theme that the rest of the line share. It has small red eyes, a small mouth, and 2 short legs that sprout from the bottom of the head torso. On top of its head are 3 broad green leaves. Upon evolving into a gloom, it keeps the same general body shape, but the green leaves have now turned brown, and situated in the top of the head is a bulbous red flower. It also grows arms and lips, strangely. A gloom stands at 2.5 feet tall and weighs an average of 19 pounds. After this second stage, the Pokemon does evolve again, but it's strange because there are actually 2 different evolutions that can take place based on what stone they're exposed to. The most common final evolution to see is Vileplume, which is what you get when you expose a gloom to a leaf stone. It grows in size, now standing about 4 feet tall and weighing 41 pounds. It still has the same body shape with the blue head torso with limbs, but the flower that is started to bloom on its head now takes over the entirety of Vileplume's head, even overhanging the edges of it by a good distance. However, the other and much more rare evolution of Gloom comes when it gets exposed to a sunstone, which doesn't happen often. Couple that with the fact that it shares very little in common appearance-wise with its previous evolutions, and you can see why it took scientists some time to figure out that Bellossom was part of the Oddish line. Bellossom doesn't have the same blue head-torso body of the others in its line, instead having a green body, with a head, chest, and arms. I'm not sure about them having feet, since they have a skirt made of grass leaves that surrounds their lower body at all times. There is a rumor that they actually don't have feet, and instead use the grass skirt itself like tentacle legs, which I find more fascinating, but a lot less cute. The flower that was on Bloom's head now has changed and split into 2 small red flowers that sit on either side of Bellossom's head. Funny enough, this is also one of the rare occasions where the final evolution actually gets smaller, with Bellossom being only an average height of 1 foot 4 inches and weighing 13 pounds. At least Bellossom smells better than Gloom does, and doesn't have toxic pollen like Vileplume. But we can get more into that later on in the guide. For now, let's go through and see if the Weed Pokemon line are actually the perfect Pokemon partners for you. Enclosure. The really nice part about these Pokemon is that their enclosure for the most part is really simple. They simply need an open patch of grassland. You see, Oddish itself is nocturnal, burying itself in the soil during the day. This is where it gets most of its nutrients, as it's thought that its feet turn into roots when it does this. And then, at night, it'll uproot itself and wander up to 1,000 feet in search of more nutrients and to spread its seeds. Mind, that's not 1,000 feet away or in a straight line, it's just covering 1,000 feet. They often have a very meandering and looping path, so you don't need an enclosure that's 1,000 feet by 1,000 feet. Really, I'd say that as long as it's 1,000 feet square, you should be good. So it should be roughly 100 by 50 feet, which, yes, is a large amount of space, but not nearly as bad as it could be. And the best part is that it just needs to be a grassy field. You don't have to put much into their enclosure at all. The most you'll have to do is enclose it so that your Pokemon doesn't wander off. So you may have to install a chain link fence to keep your Pokemon in, but really it's nothing more than a big yard. In a rare twist on the usual, Gloom actually needs less space than Oddish. This is mostly due to its feeding style. Oddish absorbs nutrients from the ground, meaning that they need to constantly wander about to find fresh nutrient-rich soil. Gloom, however, changes into an ambush insectivore. They attract bug-type Pokemon to them using the scent coming off their nectar and flower, and then, when the bug Pokemon gets close enough, they strike out and consume the bug Pokemon. This hunting style means that they don't actually move around or use a lot of room. So realistically, if you want, you could downsize the enclosure to 50 by 50 feet, still giving it plenty of room to move, but also allowing you to possibly save money on the enclosure. Moving on to the final evolutions, they don't actually change that much from Gloom. Vileplume still uses the same ambush tactics to eat bug-type Pokemon, so you don't need to change the proportions of the enclosure for that at all. The only thing you'll need to make sure to do is that there are no obstructions in the yard that their petals can get stuck or caught on, as that flower is much bigger than the one on Gloom's head. And when talking about Blossom, its feeding style changes once again. See, Blossom comes about when a Gloom comes into contact with a Sunstone, and Sunstones are generally found in more tropical areas of the world. And what's more abundant than anything in tropical areas? Sunshine. So Blossom has evolved from the ambush tactics that Gloom developed to a more plant-like photosynthesis feeding method. They simply need a large amount of sunshine every day to be able to keep themselves healthy. Mind, this doesn't mean that they don't need space to move around. Blossom is known for wandering beaches and jungles and dancing when happy. So any enclosure that they have will need to have at least a bit of space for them. All this is to say that you don't need to change the enclosure size for Blossom either. But since they photosynthesize, they will need some spaces that don't have any obstructions to the sunlight. One interesting thing to mention about Blossom is that you could technically train it to live inside your home with you. I wouldn't recommend that with any of the other evolutions, as Oddish needs to bury itself during the day, and Gloom reeks terribly to most people, and Vileplume's flower is just so big it doesn't fit well in most homes. But Blossom is small, smaller than most of the others in its evolution line, and has a friendly and non-destructive manner, making them great candidates for living in your home. If you would like to do this, then the main things to keep in mind is that your Pokemon will need plenty of time outside to get the sunshine that they need, and they will need space to move and dance, as they're wont to do. As these Pokemon are grass-type Pokemon, I should also mention that they don't do well in cold weather. If the ground freezes, then Oddish can have a hard time either pulling itself from the ground at night or digging into a new spot in the morning. As well, the cold temperatures can cause the flower petals on Gloom's, Vileplume's, and Blossom's heads to wither and become brown, which can be a major health risk for these Pokemon. So, if you happen to live in a colder region of the world, then I'm sorry, but these Pokemon might not be the best choice for you. The last thing to keep in mind when thinking of these Pokemon should be the ones that could be housed with them. After all, you'll be keeping them in your yard pretty much, so if you happen to have any other Pokemon, it's likely they'll come into contact. The first thing is that they can do well together with their own kind, but with certain specifications. If you have a lot of Oddish, then you'll need to make sure that the soil nutrients stay high, as they'll all be feeding off it at the same time. As well, with Gloom and Vileplume, they'll be competing with each other for their food. Blossom is really the only one that can be housed together without much need for supervision or your intervention. Fire-type Pokemon are a clear no-go, which should be obvious with the grass typing of this line. As well, flying type Pokemon would be a bad idea, especially with Oddish and Blossom, as they're small and can make easy prey for some of the larger predatory flying types. And you should avoid any Pokemon that are grazers, meaning that they just roam around and munch on grass all day. They may try to eat Oddish's leaves, Gloom and Vileplume's flowers, and Blossom's grass skirt. And if that happens, you'll either end up with a bite out of your Oddish line Pokemon, or a battle that may not end well for either Pokemon involved. Bug types are also not going to be a great idea either. They'll munch on Blossom, and Gloom and Vileplume will snack on them if they're small enough. Funny enough, Oddish might be a good match for some bug Pokemon, as its poison typing gives it some protection from bug types. But if you want to do that, I would only do small carnivorous ones. That way they don't try to munch on Oddish during the day. It's a lot of rules, since grass types have so many weaknesses. But as long as you follow them, then you should be good with other Pokemon. Availability. These Pokemon are generally very available. There are wild populations in all but 2 regions, those 2 being Alola and Paldea. And while they aren't available throughout the entire regions that they are present in, the areas that they are wild, they are by no means hard to find. Thanks to their diversity in feeding styles and the fact that a few of them have developed defense strategies, they've been very successful in creating large populations wherever they live. The only exception to this is the final stone evolutions. Both Vileplume and Blossom are very rare in the wild, due to the scarcity of the stones they need to evolve. Encountering a leaf stone in the wild is not something that happens often. But they aren't rarer than moonstones, so if you are patient and know the right places to look, then you might be able to find a Vileplume in the wild. The same goes for Blossom. Now, Blossom is much more rare. It's more common for sunstones to occur in tropical places, which of course makes you think of Alola, but as we've already established, there is no native Oddish population in Alola. And most other regions don't have the correct climate to form sunstones. Hoenn is close, and maybe Johto, but it means that the odds of a Gloom coming into contact with a sunstone and becoming a Blossom in the wild is very small. When talking about the breeding industry, then things get a bit odd. Sorry, I had to make that joke at some point in this guide. See, if you're looking for an Oddish, then you'll have no problems finding it at all. Running an Oddish farm is relatively simple. You just need quite a bit of space and to fertilize the soil to make sure that it stays nutritious enough for them. That level of ease means that there are people all around that have Oddish farms. But Oddish is really the only one that'll be easy to find in the breeding circuit. Gloom... Let's be honest, the limiting factor is the smell. A breeder putting up with the smell is a lot to ask, and because of that stench, you aren't going to be selling many of them. Yeah, there are people out there that do like the smell, but they are few and far between. Breeders just won't be making a profit. And this shortage of Gloom breeders leads to a shortage in the final stages. That, and the price of the stones makes these Pokemon uncommon to find for sale. So, if you want an Oddish, then I would highly suggest getting one from a breeder. But if you're looking for one of the final evolutions, then I would say that your best bet is going out and catching one. Which isn't bad because they aren't terribly dangerous as long as you have a Pokemon of your own to keep you safe. Care. Food's gonna be strange. Mostly because you don't really need to provide them food. Unlike the Bulbasaur line, which acts more animal than plant, these Pokemon are more plant than animal. And much like plants, you don't really need to provide them food like berries, as they kind of provide for themselves. Take Oddish for example. When it's buried in the soil during the day, it's actually feeding itself by absorbing the nutrients from the soil. So you don't need to feed it anything. What you'll have to do instead is make sure that the soil is in good condition for them and keep it nutritious. Since you're keeping your Oddish in an enclosed space, it's going to be feeding in the same spots over and over again. This is going to drain the nutrients from the soil over a period of time, leaving it somewhat nutrient barren and unable to feed your Pokemon. What you'll have to do is get in the habit of checking and reinvigorating the soil. They have machines that can help you with this, but the kind of balance in the soil you're looking for is slightly acidic. Not overly much, just a pH of 6 or so, but it's enough for your Oddish to thrive on. You'll also want it to be a loose, well-draining soil. The looseness will allow your Oddish to dig in rather easily when day comes, and the well-draining part will allow them to still get their water without the ground being a mud hole. If you notice that your yard doesn't naturally have the right conditions, or your Oddish has started to drain the soil from feeding, then you can add things to the soil to bring it back up to snuff. Things like fertilizer and some rotting vegetation can do wonders to help reinvigorize your dirt and allow your Oddish to be able to feed in that section again. When moving on to Gloom and Vileplume, they pretty much have the same feeding style and requirements as each other. Those requirements being that you don't really have to do much at all. Like I said in the Enclosure section, Gloom and Vileplume's flowers and bodies produce nectar and scents that attract bug Pokemon to it. Unfortunately, that is an unavoidable part of these Pokemon's biology, given that the flowers are part of their bodies. While this does mean that you won't have to consciously go out and feed these Pokemon, it does mean that they'll be attracting and eating live prey. I totally get it if that makes you uncomfortable. It does for many people. And I'm sure there are some out there that are wondering why they can't just feed their Gloom or Vileplume bug Pokemon meat, like I've done for other meat-eating Pokemon that we've covered. The thing is that you can, but they'll still attract those bug Pokemon to them. That'll lead to a situation where they either eat the meat you give them and then have a bug Pokemon problem on your hands because they're not eating them, or they end up eating the live prey anyway and don't eat the meat you give them. So unless you're planning on enclosing the entire enclosure like a greenhouse, which would be ridiculously expensive, then your Pokemon possibly eating live prey is something that you'll have to deal with. Lastly is Bellossom, who is easiest out of the four of them. The majority of Bellossom's diet is going to be sunlight. Those flowers on their heads and the leaves that make up their skirt photosynthesize the sunlight and produce almost enough nutrients for the Pokemon to survive on all by themselves. Almost. Bellossom is still an animal, and the plants on its body aren't enough to keep it going normally. I mean, it's not a Sunflora after all. So you'll have to give it a meal of berries once a day, about 2/3 of a cup. It can be a mix of any berries you want, but I would stick with the fruit that grows in tropical regions. Things like the Mancos, the Wiki, and the Nanab berries, as those are the berries that they're most likely to eat when they're in the wild. Combine that with plenty of time outside in the sunshine, and you'll have a Bellossom that grows happy and healthy. And that's mostly it for these Pokemon. Really, they're a very hands-off line, so there isn't much in the care section to talk about. Though there are a few smaller things, like how if you have a Gloom and you don't like the smell that it gives off, it would be best to spend time with it and form a close bond with it. I know, that sounds counterproductive, but the fact is that the more relaxed and comfortable the Gloom feels, then the less intense the smell gets. Even to the point where, according to a few accounts I found, the Pokemon is so relaxed that it'll emit no scent at all. So dealing with the smell for a little bit early on can make it so that you don't have to deal with the smell at all later. Also, speaking of bonding with these Pokemon, it's pretty easy to form a bond with Bellossom thanks to its proclivity to dance. They'll dance just on their own throughout the day, but if you put on music for them, they'll be much happier and dance more energetically because of it. And should you join in on the dancing, well, your Pokemon will just be over the moon happy just because you're sharing one of its favorite pastimes. It's not a major thing, since a strong bond isn't necessary for these Pokemon to be great household Pokemon, but it's still something that I think you should explore. A strong bond with your Pokemon can make your lives so much better. Cost. Enclosure-wise, you're probably looking at the high category, and that's simply because you have to fence in such a large area of land for your Pokemon. But there is still a range of how much this can cost you. The cheapest option would be a wood fence, but you can also spend more money to get a chain link fence, or any other material you'd like. You can also save money by installing the fence yourself, or you can save time by hiring a company to come in and put the fence up for you. But again, either way, you're gonna be in the high category. The food price will actually vary depending on what evolution you currently have. Oddish might be the most expensive one with the fertilizer, and even then, it'll be in the low or maybe even the moderate categories depending on what brand you get. It could be even cheaper if you decide to buy it in bulk. Blossom will be in the low category as well. With the small amount of fruit you give them per day, it's almost a negligent cost. Just pick some up when you go to the grocery store. And then Gloom and Vileplume catch their own food. So it's nothing, which I guess is technically in the very low category. In all, this line is not very expensive to feed whatsoever. Again, with the Pokemon itself, the price will fluctuate depending on which one you want. If you want an Oddish, then it's going to be in the very low category, whether you get a breeder one or a wild one. Gloom, however, while still in the very low category from the wild, will be more expensive if you get one from a breeder. Really, the only advantage to a breeder-raised one is that it'll be more comfortable around you right away, and stink way less because of it. If that means a lot to you, then a breeder-raised Gloom will probably be in the low to moderate categories. And then, the final evolutions will be in the high or very high categories, simply because the price of the stones will be added on top of the breeder's price. I guess they could be in the low category if you manage to find one in the wild, but the chances of that are slim and you'd need more advanced Pokeballs for that to be reliable, so it's probably going to cost you more even from the wild. Conclusion. You know, I never expected that the two grass types that we've covered so far would be the ones to make the best pets. I mean, Blossom is about as easy as it gets. Sure, there are some downsides. Oddish is nocturnal, Gloom stinks, and the final evolutions need stones, but even still, to me, that doesn't outweigh the benefits of these Pokemon. They're easy to get a hold of, easy to care for, easy to interact with. If you have a busy life and don't have much time to spend taking care of a Pokemon, or just want a Pokemon species that can really take care of itself without much interference from you, then I would highly recommend any of the Oddish evolutions. Thank you all for listening, and please join us again for the next episode where we cover the mushroom bug Pokemon Paris and its evolution Parasect. Have a wonderful night, everyone.